Alrighty, what's going on, everybody? Good to see everybody back. Alex with you here again. And today I just want to go ahead and, as I've mentioned in the previous video where I talked about the history of Dubrovnik, I just wanted to sit down one more time and show you the Dubrovnik set that I got from the House of Staunton one more time so that you guys can get a better idea about what type of set it is. In this video, I'm not going to take out my scale or take out the measurement ruler. Because I've already done all the measurements beforehand at work. I had a little bit of time at work, so I decided, hey, why not utilize this time wisely? So I did all the measurements, weighed all the pieces, and then it got me thinking, like, I got these other chess sets that I've purchased that are also 3.75-inch king. For example, this is the king that belongs to the 1972 Fischer-Spassky set that I got from Chess Bazaar. And then this king here belongs to the Queen's Gambit chess set that I also acquired not too long ago. And so what I did is I took these chess pieces and I did all the measurements on those as far as weight, as far as height, and also the diameter of the base. And the interesting thing is that they weren't equal, which I didn't expect them to be equal, but they were different. And that's also one of the things that I want to talk to you guys today briefly about. Hopefully the information in this video will be relevant and important to a lot of you guys. I want to go ahead and get started with the Dubrovnik. There is going to be a slight variance between the light pieces and the dark pieces, even though, as I've mentioned in the previous video, the wood from which the light and the dark pieces are made is the same wood, it's boxwood. The only difference is that the dark pieces are going to be stained a little bit more, and then the light pieces are stained a little bit less. There's still variance. There's still variance in height, even though that variance might be very small. I mean, we're talking maybe 0.5 millimeter. There's also going to be differences in weight, and there's going to be slight differences in the diameter of the base of the pieces. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look. This is the light side of the Dubrovnik burnt chess set from the House of Staunton. The king here measures at 66 grams. The queen measures at 49 grams. The bishop measures at 43 grams. The knight measures at 46 grams. So the knight's actually a little bit heavier by 3 grams than the bishop. The rook measures at 48 grams. So the rook is that much heavier. And then the pawn here measures at 17 grams. As far as the dark pieces, for the most part, every piece is going to be about the same as far as the weight, except the queen of the dark set is going to be 3 grams heavier, and then the pawn of the dark set is 2 grams heavier. The rest of the pieces is exactly the same. If we were to continue the analysis of just looking at the weight differences between the different pieces, let's just assume that in general, most of the chess sets that you guys will encounter, the king, being the largest piece, will probably be the heaviest for the most part. Aside from some of the more elaborate chess sets where the knight might be like really, really big. In that case, maybe the knight might be heavier. But for the most part, the king tends to be the largest piece. It occupies the largest amount of room on the square, and it also weighs the most. So if we were to say that 66 grams, being that it is the largest piece, let's say that's 100%. So 100% of 66 is 100. The queen, being at 49 grams, is only at 74%. 74% the weight of the king. So there's a pretty steep drop off from 100% to 74. Is this relevant to any of you guys? Well, I do want to kind of show you guys this information because in a minute here, when I show you guys the other chess sets, you will notice that some of those percentages will actually differ. So 66 grams, 49 grams at 74%. Further moving on, this 43 grams at 65%. 46 grams at 70% of weight of the king. 48 grams at 73%. 17 grams, that's only 26% the weight of the king. So as far as the weight, if we were to chart it, we would see that there's the king, and then there's a pretty steep immediate drop off, and then it sort of trails down. Same goes for the height. I did measure my heights for this particular set in millimeters, just like because I felt that millimeters would give us a little bit more precise measurement. We know that this chess set does indicate that this is a 3.75 inch king. So with that being said, the king in this particular case is 97.5 millimeters. The queen is at 78.5 millimeters, which is 81% of the height of the king. Moving further, the bishop is at 75.5, which is at 77% of the height of the king. Knight at 64.1, which is 63%. Rook is at 57, which is 58%. And then finally, the pawn is at 49.2, which is 50%. As I measured all the three different chess sets, I noticed that there was a similarity that usually the pawn would tend to be about 50% the height of the king for all of the 3.75 inch sets that I measured. Now that being said, if let's say that you purchased a set that measured only 3 inches, 3-inch king, for example, so it was a shorter king, there's a pretty good chance that the rest of the pieces would not have as steep of a drop off because the king already is pretty small. So then the pieces would end up being shorter and shorter than the king, but that drop off might not be as substantial. And with that being said, let's say that you ordered like a 3-inch king set, the pawn may end up being like 65%, maybe even close to 70% of the king's height, just because the pawn still needs to be of a certain height, otherwise it would just be difficult to play. As far as the aesthetics of the pieces, I did want to show you guys how these sets look. As I've mentioned in the previous video, when it comes to burnt chess sets, there's a couple of different varieties in general as far as like the markings on the pieces. These, as you can see here, have these flower arrangement with these lines and divergent lines, little dots. Mostly it's kind of like a flower arrangement. You also see that there's a lot of burnt chess sets sold online that have these little hash marks, these like crisscross marks, especially on the base, that are a little bit more on the budget friendly. And then when you get into these flower engravings, they tend to be a little bit more expensive. My best guess is that it's just easier for them to either use a machine or just overall it would be easier to create just crisscross markings as opposed to creating these like little flower-like arrangements because the flower-like arrangements, I guess, take a little bit longer to create. You could see the shape of the king has the large dark ball on the top, then it has a fairly flat top portion and then kind of a drop off here, and then a pretty wide base overall, okay? The queen has a similar black ball, it's just a little bit smaller, with 6 different cuts here, and then it sort of trails down to give you about a very similar diameter bottom. The bishop here, you could see that they've strived or they attempted to make this cut through the bishop, but then it's almost like a pseudo cut because it really doesn't go deep into the piece. The top portion of the bishop is pretty big, and then this neck here is going to be almost the same height as the top. I've seen that in a couple of other like European chess sets. Okay, so moving on, we have the knight, as I've shown you guys before. I really like the conservative look of the face where it's just sort of tucked in a little bit. The rook here is pretty large compared to the rest of the pieces as far as weight and height. It's not the highest piece, but definitely it is going to be a heavier piece. In fact, weight-wise, it's almost as heavy as the queen. The base of it is also pretty large, and my best guess is because the base is a little bit larger, they're able to put in a slightly bigger weight inside of it. And then, of course, you have the pawn at the very end. Pawn's not super heavy. It's not super tall. It's just kind of an overall average-looking pawn. So as I've mentioned before, you could see here the wood from which the dark pieces are made is going to be the same wood that the light pieces are. It's just that it's coated a little bit more completely. I could have ordered the golden rosewood, but I ended up getting this one. just because I feel like there's a little bit of more contrast and I can see the pattern a little bit better. One of the things that I feel like this set, the pattern, these little flowers that you can see here, it sort of reminds me of like a European, almost like a Slavic look. Remember those Russian dolls that you put in one doll inside of the other? They have sometimes those similar arrangement with flowers and little petals and branches. So this is kind of how it feels to me. I almost feel like the best type of a board that you could play this on would be maybe even one with like decorations on the side, like flower patterns and everything, just to complete overall look. One of my reservations at first was I felt like the different arrangements and the different patterns on these pieces would be a little bit distracting during actual play. Honestly, I don't think that's the case. I feel like overall the pieces are made well. They are well crafted. They look ornate, but they don't look distracting. What looks distracting is when they'll have these different themed sets where they'll have different colors on the pieces, like a American flag or something. In my opinion, that would look distracting. But because the pattern here sort of repeats itself and it doesn't take away from overall shape of the pieces, I don't necessarily think it's distracting. I feel like it looks pretty, and at the same time, it just I could see myself playing with this with friends. When you guys look at this, you might say, "Wow, does this feel rough or smooth as far as the actual pieces?" It's kind of a weird in between feeling. I would probably say it feels more rough than smooth, but it's not the type of roughness where you feel you would be concerned that you would get splinters if you hold these pieces. It's kind of like the top portion here has been smoothed out, and yet there's all these cuts inside of it that almost make it feel a little bit rough. But overall, that roughness doesn't take away from the quality of the set. In fact, probably what it more feels to me is that with it being a little bit more rough like this, they're easier to grab than some of the like more polished pieces. I feel like that would be easier to not slip in your hand. They got a little bit better grip overall. Underneath the king is your usual green felt, but in this particular case, the felt is this dark green color. Most of the other sets that I've seen generally have this like lighter color felt. So I feel like I'm not really sure if there's that much of a difference. I feel like the darker color felt maybe just a little bit softer and kind of just a tad bit thicker with softer feel overall. I think it slides a little bit better, but I don't really think there's that much of a difference between the felt. So these are the three different 3.75-inch king chess sets that I have. The 1972 Fischer-Spassky, the Queen's Gambit, and now the Dubrovnik, all of which indicate that this is a 3.75-inch king set. This one's at 95 millimeters, this one's at 96.5 millimeters, and this one's at 97.5 millimeters. It doesn't seem like a whole lot. I mean, millimeters is so thin, but still. And then once again, this king here, as you could tell, is a little bit taller than this king. However, the top portion of the king, if we weren't to take account the finial, the top portion of this king is actually shorter than this king, as you could tell. Whereas, this king is a little bit, it's almost the same height as this one, and yet it's 2.5 millimeters taller because that finial is just so large overall. When we look at the other pieces, as for example here, we start to notice that there's a lot of differences. While the Dubrovnik king was the tallest king, that is not the same for the queens. The Queen's Gambit set king is actually the tallest one in this case. And these two are almost the same in height, but you're starting to see a little bit of a change. We can see the same going for the bishops. Here, this bishop is really tall, this bishop's short, this bishop's kind of in between. Same goes for the knights, but as far as the knights go, I guess we can't blame the knights just because the knights is going to be like the most variable piece in an entire chess set. So to tell you guys, this knight's shorter, this knight's taller, they're all different shapes. So I guess it's not as relevant, but still something to take into account. If you have a really, really tall king and then the knight's like super tiny, you know, it just goes to show you that you can't just rely on the information simply about the king to give you an idea about how big the rest of the pieces are. Here's a striking example. All 3.75-inch kings. Queen Gambit looks like it doesn't even belong here. I mean, this is like the younger brother of the two other ones. This one here is the heaviest and has the broadest base. This one's a little bit thinner neck, but this one is just like, what is this? Does this even belong here? It's maybe like it makes you feel like they just substituted a different type of rook into the set. Once again, a striking example. You know, you would think you would be getting a certain size rook with 3.75-inch king, but that's not necessarily the case all the time. You have to kind of pay attention to how the other pieces look. Lastly, if we look at the pawns here, we could also tell that the pawns are not all the same. Pawns tend to have different base. Like this Fischer-Spassky actually is pretty big, and I like that some of these pawns with a really broad base, because for one, it's a little bit heavier. Two is it occupies a greater portion of the square, and it just, in my opinion, looks more aesthetic. When the base diameter of the pawn is really tiny, it's not that it's not playable. It's just it feels like it's got way too much room around it. And if they do recommend like the Fischer-Spassky one, they probably recommend a 2.25-inch board. This right here is a 2.25-inch squares. The pawns will look really nice on this board, whereas maybe the Queen's Gambit, the pawns looks nice still. However, it just feels to me like there's a little too much room here, and I would probably prefer to have a base a little bit bigger. Now, when I mentioned before, generally the trend for 3.75-inch king, as far as the measurements I've done, is that the pawns will measure about 50% of the height of the king. Now let's introduce one more pawn here, just for the sake of... Here's another pawn, and this pawn, as you could tell, it's a little bit, maybe just a tiny bit taller, but not a whole lot. I mean, maybe a millimeter taller, but probably almost the same height as this pawn right here. So we could see like that. Base-wise, it's about the same base as the pawn from the Fischer-Spassky. Okay? If this is the pawn from the Dubrovnik, and let's take a look at the Dubrovnik king right here. Okay? Then this pawn here, which is almost the same height as the other pawns, that's from the Poulsen. From the Poulsen, I mean, there's a substantial difference in height and overall weight of the pieces, but the pawns, as you could tell, are still pretty small. So that's another interesting information for you guys. You know, even though and here, I don't have to go too far. Here's another example, a 4.4-inch Modena chess set with a pawn this big. So you can't rely just on the height of the king to give you information about how big the rest of the set is. In fact, it would probably be more important to try to seek out chess sets that have measurements for the rest of the pieces, and to kind of get a better idea about, you know, like where the other pieces lie as far as weight, height, diameter, and everything. Anyways, so what I'll do is I did this like huge list of measurements, and I was going to just like ramble on and tell you guys exactly, like number by number, what the measurements are. Instead, what I'll do is I'll take that giant chart of all the measurements that I've done as far as the basis, the weights, and the percentages for all the three different chess sets that I did, the Spassky, the Dubrovnik, and the Queen's Gambit, and I'll just throw them below in the description for anybody who's interested in looking at those numbers, to show you that although the differences as far as like the heights, the weights, and everything, they're minor, there's still going to be variance. They're still not going to be like adhering to a particular standard. And with that being said, the bigger the king, or maybe the smaller, the more it is outside the norm, the more likely the rest of the pieces might also be outside of the norm. So anyways, once again, thanks for stopping by. As always, I'm really appreciative. I enjoy sharing content with you guys. You know, I really like that time of the week when I actually get to sit down and talk to you guys about, you know, the different chess sets, share with you guys ideas, certain information I found. Let's stay tuned until our next video, okay, guys? Alrighty. See you guys later. Bye-bye.